Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar. My name is Jane Zupan. I am here today with Will Johnson, who is Attivio's Chief Technical Officer and one of its co-founders. Our topic today is content classification and sentiment analysis. And before we get started, I'm just going to go over a couple of very brief housekeeping items. So the first thing is that this webinar is being recorded. Everyone who signed up will get a link, an email with a link to the recording. So if you want to share it with colleagues, you're welcome to do that. And the second item is about Q&A. We have reserved 5 minutes at the end of the session for questions, but you can enter your questions at any time during the session. Just use the question box and go to webinar. So with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Will, and he'll talk to you about classification and sentiment.
Great. Thanks, Jane. The first thing we want to talk about with classification and sentiment is why you would use it to begin with. What sort of value can it bring? How can it really help you change your business? And what we're showing here is just a basic screenshot of a knowledge management application that we use in a lot of our demos. It has all the basic things you would expect in most intranet search type applications. It has facets on the left, key phrases, authors, hit highlighting, and it brings in a number of different sources from news and email, and then an internal file share. What we've done though is classified this content from the file share into 3 different buckets, one for research, one for grant proposals, and one for dissertations. And for an organization that's heavily focused on research like this, being able to slice and dice the data and quickly drill in based on the type of content is incredibly useful just for your average everyday knowledge worker. Again, just being able to better understand the content that's being presented to you, and again, being able to find it a little bit faster. A very different use case for sentiment analysis is one we're showing here. This is a POC that we worked on with one of our customers. And the idea here between these 2 screens was to be able to provide a dashboard, BI-centric view of essentially notes that students took about courses and different instructors to understand, did they like the class, did they not like the class. There's a bunch of other entities that were pulled out about speakers and homework assignments and things like that. But the overall sort of red and green indicators shown in a couple different visualizations here, we're really trying to break down the sentiment. What do students think of different instructors, different classes, maybe different facilities that the classes were held in, and how can we use that to better train, target, and understand our students' experience with our classes. Again, very different sort of consumer models. One is very customer focused, and one is sort of more administrative. One is a web and front end, and one is a BI front end. But under the hood, using that same content classification and sentiment type capabilities to be able to power visualizations and business value. So how do we go about doing this? Machine learning based classification, it built into Attivio, does rely on the use of training sets. And so the first step in deploying any sort of classification-based technique, whether it's content classification or sentiment, is to develop a training set. So here we've pulled together, and this is a very, very common type use case, some Q&A type material, maybe some 10Qs, some news articles, and some earnings. These might all be on a file share somewhere. You might pull together, different training sets from different websites. It really doesn't depend where the content comes from, as long as they are all sort of, really good representative articles or news stories or files or research reports or whatever they are about fairly independent topics. The most important thing when creating a training set is having enough of those samples. If you just have sort of 2 or 3 independent Q&A articles and 10Qs and so on, you can train a model, but the accuracy is, can leave something to be desired. The more, the better. Ideally 100 of each example, up to 1,000 or more, depending on the type of quality you're trying to drive from the application. Once you have the samples, you feed them into the system. There's a workflow that's pre-built into the platform that will automatically train the model with the machine learning based classifier. So it's looking at examples of all of these documents, looking at the label that's been applied to them, and by label it's really just the folder they were in on disk. And at the end, it produces a model, which we'll sort of show where that gets used in just a second. And this model is just essentially a binary representation of the type of signals that the machine used or can use to disambiguate the different content classes here. One of the more interesting aspects of what Attivio provides out of the box is the notion of doing some cross-validation. So whenever we pull in the 100 examples of QA, 100 of 10Qs, 100 of news, and 100 of earnings in this example, we'll process all 100, but we'll actually only train the model on the first 90 of each. And we'll hold back a sample set of 10 from each of them. And then we can test the produced model against those remaining 10 examples from each. So we're able to actually provide an accuracy score against that. It's a pretty standard cross-validation technique, but it is something that's very important when you start thinking about changes to the model over time. Is the model getting better or worse? And trying to set your business users' expectations about the level of confidence they can have in the model. So you might not get 97% accuracy on day one, but over time, as you add more content, as you refine your training set, you should be able to continually increase the accuracy up to whatever you feel is necessary for your application. Once you have the model, it's then it's a pretty straightforward task to deploy that to production. Again, it's just a binary artifact. You can take it from one installation, maybe a development or a QA environment, and deploy it to a production cluster if that makes sense. Once that model is deployed, you can then start to feed content to it. So a piece of content would flow into the system, and then on the other side, a piece of metadata would be applied to that document that gives you not only the category that was applied, and we can also support outputting multiple possible categories, if that makes sense, but also a confidence score. So in this case, we're 60% confident, or the model is 60% confident that this document is a 10Q. If you output multiple classifications, you'll get scores for each of them that you can set thresholds on and sort, and depending on your use case, you may want to present one or more of those to the end user. But it's a pretty straightforward process. From there, again, continual training if that's required. You may want to allow your users to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down on the classification to let you know, or provide some sort of administrative feedback. All of those examples can go back into your training set. You sort of rinse and repeat, train the system, get a new model, check its accuracy score, deploy it to production, and so on. But generally speaking, it's not a heavy sort of administrative overhead. There aren't rules and policies and things like that to maintain it. It really is all done by the machine. Sentiment, on the other hand, is very similar operationally. The only difference is the input sets. And with Sentiment, it's really only positive or negative that you need to worry about. The out-of-the-box model that we ship is trained on product reviews. You can think about, Best Buy, type product reviews that you would see, or Amazon.com style product reviews. But you can take any set of positive and negative, or really any binary classification of content, supply it, and the same process runs through with the accuracy score, the cross-validation, and the operational concerns. The nice thing about Sentiment is you can use it for sort of, as I said, any type of binary classification. So things like threatening or non-threatening, like or dislike, risky or non-risky. Anything that you can classify into those two buckets can be used by the Sentiment classification engine. And so what that turns into is, the ability to drive some really interesting interfaces from a customer perspective. So here we have two examples. The one on the left is, what you consider to be a positive email you might get from a customer about customer support. So they're using words like delighted and wonderful, which are some good indicators. But what's more interesting is they use a key phrase called service desk, and that's that might be on a managed list of terms that the enterprise is interested in checking in on and seeing what their customers think about it, or it might be something that the Attivio engine pulls out automatically with key phrases. We're not only able to pull out the fact that service desk was a key phrase and that the overall document was positive, we're also able to tell you specifically that service desk was mentioned positively, whereas something else in the same document may be mentioned negatively, and we're able to disambiguate the difference between those two. The example I always use is, I love my iPhone, but I hate my carrier, whoever that happens to be. And in that context, you're able to understand that my affinity for the product, the iPhone, is very different than my dislike of the service provider, which allows you to, if you're a product manager for, the iPhone or some electronic goods, you're able to understand that, you actually have a positive relationship with your customers, but maybe you need to work on your carrier contracts or your carrier agreements. Conversely, if you're working for one of the carriers, you can understand that you need to, maybe you want to, promote more specific products that have positive sentiment, and work on some service issues on your end. Over on the right-hand side, there's a similar example. Someone's deeply concerned about an issue they've had with their washing machine. They bought it. They made 3 repair calls. Again, the red and green here are meant to show the positive and negative words, and they're not only used for classification purposes. We actually mark up the content in place and are able to tell you, which words were mentioned positively or which words were understood to be positive and negative, and how they relate to the key phrases here of the washing machine. So we, sort of wrap in this presentation, sort of wrap little red brackets around the term washing machine to let you know that it's being viewed negatively in this piece of content. And we not only do that in the presentation, but actually in the product itself, it can tell you and highlight and mark up in the result set which specific entities or key phrases or terms were viewed positively and negatively. And again, with all of these, whether it's at the document level or the entity level, we provide confidence scores for all of them. So, we might be 10% confident that it's a related to the service desk, but we're 90% sure that it's a positive email, and so on. So again, you get the strength of sentiment, accuracy of the classification, and you do get the sentiment both at the doc and the entity level. And just as a side note, the way we do entity level sentiment extraction is one of sort of our core IP assets that we have here at Attivio. We do it in a very different way than a lot of other people in the industry, and it's something that we've had patented for a couple of years now. And so what can this really allow you to do for your customers? One is allow you to understand them better, take their temperature. If you go back to the course survey screenshots that I showed you, what do your students think of the instructors? What do they think of the material? It also allows you to measure the impact of events. So if you host some event or release a new product or something like that, you're able to understand how your customers portray your brand, because you're able to see how the sentiment changes over time or how it changes related to a specific product or service that you offer based on some action that you take. And more importantly, it just allows you to follow trends from a data-driven perspective. It's one thing to have a gut check and to read a few emails here and there from customers, but if you can really start to aggregate that information, use the power of the machine to classify every email so that you can then roll that up into dashboards, you're really able to be able to make better decisions about your customers. The next is to understand your product better. We see sentiment analysis being used by a number of product managers to understand issues before they pop up. Same thing with classification. Again, looking at every email from customers, every post on a forum, every post on social media, to be able to pull out, understand what product it's related to, and then understand what people are saying about it. You can then use that to prioritize development, and again, more data-driven decisions about your product based on what's being said and how it's being said in the world. And then last is just being able to drive really amazing user experiences. The content classification can allow users, especially knowledge workers, but really any application user, to be able to drill into content that they find relevant, interesting, without sort of having to keep adding more and more keywords or keep hunting and pecking around. If the more the system can present and give them ways to navigate through the content, the better. All of that makes information sort of more readily accessible at your fingertips. And then one thing we haven't talked about as much, which will be coming in a following webinar in the next couple months, is the ability to use content classification to be able to understand users' queries, to be able to deliver answers and not just lists of results. So this is a new capability that we're starting to deliver now to a handful of customers, and it's probably one of the more interesting future developments over the next, call it 3 to 6 months here at Attivio, is this ability, again, for the machine to be able to understand the user's query for content classification purposes. I think that's it.
Good. All right. So just a reminder for our audience, if you have questions for Will, now is the time to put them in the question box and go to webinar. I've got a couple questions in the queue, and we'll just go through the queue. So Will, first question. Somebody is asking, do you provide pre-configured models for classification or sentiment out of the box?
Great question. One we get fairly often. For sentiment, we do provide a generic English sentiment model out of the box. It's pretty good in sort of a domain agnostic form. It is trained on product review information, but we found it's fairly applicable across verticals. But for any serious production application where high quality sentiment is required, you really should train your own model. The way financial traders talk positively or negatively about assets is very different than the way biotech drug researchers talk about the possibilities for new possible compounds or drugs or things like that. So you really need to have samples of the text that you're working on to be able to train a sentiment model. For classification, we do not provide models out of the box. Again, that's even more specific. In the example that I showed with the, let me just flip back to it quickly. The example I showed in the very beginning with the screenshot of research, grant proposals, and dissertations, there's no possible way we could have models to cover every possible use case in every way users would want to slice and dice their data. But what we've done is built the tooling and the support to be able to build these models, train these models easily, and deploy them out to production.
Okay, good. So next question. Somebody is saying, what kind of accuracy can we expect?
Another great question, one we also get all the time. The accuracy is really dependent on the training set. We oftentimes see accuracy well over 80% with a reasonable amount of sample data. Call it 100 examples of each category. The more sample data, the better sample data you're able to provide, the better. You can drive it certainly upwards of 90-95% if you have enough sample data. I'd say that the one mistake a lot of people make or start to walk down that path is they want to have hundreds of different categories that are barely indistinguishable from each other. You might have world economic news versus Northern American economic news or something like that. In a lot of those cases, unless you have really great training data that really has heavily distinguishes between those two sets, it's very difficult for the machine to understand the differences, especially if there are, again, 100 other categories that it's trying to be able to disambiguate. So a reasonable amount of categories, usually on the order of, say, 5 to 30, with fewer being not necessarily better, but certainly easier to get training data for and to train, is where we sort of guide customers to be. And again, with that, you should be able to get easily upwards of 80 to 90+% accuracy without too much effort.
Okay, good. So next question. What reporting is available? It looks like you use Tableau.
So this UI is actually a Spotfire dashboard. This dashboard is just accessing our index via our native SQL capability. The sentiment output, the classification output ends up as metadata in our index. So you can use it from a search UI such as this one if you wanted to. You can think of over here on the left-hand side there could be another facet for positive or negative sentiment. Or you could have it across the top for different sentiment levels. But the sort of the UI or the consumption is really up to you, and you can use multiple different UI technologies that all have access to the same metadata, whether it's sentiment or classification. From a model training perspective, there's the interface for building the models, for training the models, and deploying the models is all our out-of-the-box administrative interface. And as a part of that training process, the accuracy score is reported in the system.
Okay, good. So next question. In text classification, how do you know how many word combinations or n-grams do you have to use for better modeling?
So it's not so much about the number of word combinations. What we've tried to do with the tooling is really just bubble it up to the number of sample documents that you need to have. And I point out sort of the high level accuracy score. We also report accuracy scores on a per label basis, so you'll know if you're sort of lacking good sample data in any one of these categories, for example, or any multiple categories potentially. But what we found is getting sample data is not particularly. It's usually the hardest part. Once you've gathered sample data, everything else really kind of falls through. And again, what we found is as long as you can go back and get more, upwards of 100 documents, it's really pretty straightforward. And having to worry about numbers of n-grams and combinations of words and things like that is. Yes, you might be able to drive the accuracy by half a percentage point, but the effort required to do that is usually not worth it compared to just getting more sample data.
Okay, good. Okay, so the questions keep coming in. So here's the next question. If we use text classification for content recommendation to users, how do we answer questions like why a recommendation is made? This is the type of question that business users ask.
Yep, that's a great question. We certainly hear that anytime you turn capabilities over to machine learning based, artificial intelligence based algorithms and processes, business users always or regulators also especially want to be able to understand why something happened. What we're able to do at Attivio is sort of, as I've shown here with the deeply disappointed and delighted and wonderful being highlighted in green, that information comes back in the API and can be presented in the front end if required. We can do the same thing for the classification information. So we can tell you sort of at a high level the words and phrases that we picked out of the text that led us to believe it was of a particular classification. It's not sort of, as with any machine learning based algorithm, it's not easy for sort of a casual business user to necessarily understand the algorithm behind it, but we can at least point out sort of again those terms and phrases that led the machine to judge it one way or another.
Okay, good. All right. Well, that's all of that covers all of the questions that we have. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up now. And before you go, I want to point out that there is a free download available of the Attivio platform. So you can go to attivio.com. There's a button at the top right-hand corner of the website and sign up so that you can try the Attivio platform with your own data, your own information sources. So with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you, Will, for your presentation.
Thank you, everyone.